The Vikings. To many, they are the stuff of legend, a brutal and mysterious force that swept across Europe during the early Middle Ages. Their name stirs images of fierce warriors, shielded in iron, their longships slicing through the waves as they descended upon coastal villages. Yet, beyond the myths and the fear they evoked, there lies a deeper story, one of survival, resilience, and an intimate connection with the unforgiving ocean. Picture yourself standing on the edge of a rugged coastline, wind whipping through your hair. The horizon stretches endlessly before you, where sky and sea meet in an almost impossible dance of light and water. Suddenly, in the distance, you spot the unmistakable shape of a longship cutting through the mist, its slender, dragon-headed prow rising and falling with the waves. The air is thick with anticipation, as the thunderous rhythm of rowing echoes across the water, a beat that seems to call forth the ancient spirits of these seafaring people. These were the Vikings, the Norsemen, whose very existence was tied to the sea. They were not simply invaders, they were explorers, traders, and settlers. Their voyages stretched from the icy shores of Scandinavia to the bustling markets of Constantinople, and even to the far reaches of North America, long before Columbus. To understand how these warriors, often portrayed as barbaric and uncivilized, managed to endure such perilous journeys, we must first enter their world. And it was a world unlike any other, a world where survival was not guaranteed, and the relentless force of nature was both an enemy and an ally. In this era, the Viking longship was not just a vessel, it was a lifeline. Built with an ingenuity that would rival any modern engineering marvel, the longship was designed for speed, flexibility, and resilience. Its shallow draft allowed it to navigate both the open seas and the narrowest rivers, giving the Vikings an unparalleled advantage in their raids and explorations. But it wasn't only its design that made these ships so extraordinary, it was the lifestyle they facilitated. These longships carried the Vikings for months at a time, through storms, calm seas, and treacherous waters. They were the floating homes of a people who had no choice but to live in the most extreme conditions. 4 months on end, these Norsemen would spend their days and nights on these slender boats, battling the elements and the dangers that lurked in the deep. They had no modern medicines, no antibiotics, and no hospitals to retreat to when illness struck. The open sea was both their path to fortune and their greatest adversary. Yet, despite these daunting odds, the Vikings survived, and in many cases, thrived. How did they manage to avoid the sicknesses and diseases that would have plagued any other group of people confined to such harsh conditions? This question has haunted historians for centuries. The answer, as we'll discover, lies in a combination of their unyielding resilience, their advanced knowledge of the natural world, and perhaps even the mysterious ways in which their bodies adapted to the demands of life on the sea. But before we dive into the specifics of Viking health and survival, let's consider for a moment the scope of their voyages. The Vikings were not merely coastal raiders as they are often portrayed in popular culture. They were seafarers who crisscrossed vast distances, moving between kingdoms and continents, sometimes navigating unfamiliar waters for months on end. It's hard to imagine the kind of courage required to undertake such journeys without knowing what lay ahead. The uncertainty of the sea was ever present, and yet, it was precisely this uncertainty that made the Vikings both formidable and successful. They were masters of the unpredictable. They learned to read the skies, the stars, and the changing tides with a skill passed down from generation to generation. But what exactly did it mean to live aboard a Viking longship? It was not the luxurious experience we might imagine from modern sea travel. These ships were narrow, cramped, and often dangerously unstable. With every wave, the Vikings were forced to balance between the fear of capsizing and the will to press forward. The decks were slippery with salt water, and the air was thick with the stench of sweat, fish, and the remnants of fires used for cooking. Life on board was a constant struggle to maintain order amid chaos. There was little respite from the ceaseless motion of the ship as it rocked in the open sea. The Vikings were often hunched together, shoulder to shoulder, sharing what little space there was. Yet, despite these challenges, the Vikings had a remarkable capacity for endurance. How did they manage to avoid falling ill during these long voyages? It was a question that would come to shape the narrative of Viking survival. For unlike many other seafaring peoples, the Vikings seemed to escape the plagues and illnesses that would have crippled others. Their success, in many ways, depended not just on their ability to fight but on their ability to endure. They developed ways to protect themselves, not only from external enemies but from the sicknesses and maladies that could spread within the close quarters of their longships. As we journey further into this story, we will uncover the secrets of their survival, what they ate, how they maintained their health, and how their bodies adapted to life at sea. We will learn about their clever use of natural resources, their reliance on simple but effective hygiene practices, and how their immune systems became finely tuned to the harsh conditions of their environment. In many ways, the Viking longship itself became a symbol of their strength, a vessel that was not just designed to carry them from one place to another but to protect them from the unseen dangers of the sea. This story, however, is not just about the physical aspects of survival. It is about the mental and emotional resilience that defined the Viking people. How did they endure the isolation and the loneliness of life on the sea, knowing that death could come at any moment? What drove them to continue despite the harshness of their world? Was it their belief in the gods, the unbreakable bond between warriors, or the simple will to survive? This is the heart of the Viking story, an exploration of what it truly means to be human when faced with insurmountable odds. As we delve deeper into the details of Viking survival, we will explore how their relationships with each other, their environment, and even their gods played a role in their ability to endure months on end in the harshest conditions. The more we understand about the Vikings and the longships that carried them across the seas, the more we come to realize that their survival was not just about strength or luck. It was about a way of life, a philosophy that prioritized resilience, community, and a profound connection to the world around them. In the coming sections, we will uncover the true secrets of how the Vikings managed to survive against all odds. But for now, imagine yourself aboard one of those longships, watching the horizon fade into the endless expanse of water, knowing that the next few months of your life will be spent in this unforgiving world. The fear is palpable, the uncertainty overwhelming. And yet, there is something deeply inspiring about the way these warriors lived, something we can all learn from. The Vikings were not just survivors, they were conquerors of the seas, masters of endurance, and above all, people whose legacy still echoes through the ages. The longship. It was far more than a vessel to the Vikings. It was the very embodiment of their way of life, their identity, and their legacy. To understand how the Vikings survived on these perilous voyages, we must first dive into the heart of their world, the longship itself. This magnificent creation was not merely a boat but a finely tuned, living organism, a structure that held together their hopes, their futures, and their warriors in a symbiotic relationship with the sea. Imagine, if you will, standing on the shore, watching as a longship approaches, cutting through the waves with an almost graceful precision. It is sleek, with a long, narrow hull designed to slice effortlessly through both the open sea and shallow rivers. At the prow, a carved dragon head stretches toward the sky, its menacing eyes watching over the journey. The ship seems alive, as if it is a creature of the sea itself, born from the natural elements. This is not just a boat. It is a Viking longship, a masterpiece of craftsmanship that allowed the Vikings to conquer, explore, and survive the most hostile environments. The construction of the longship was a feat of extraordinary skill and innovation. Its design was both practical and symbolic, a testament to the ingenuity of the Viking people. Crafted from the dense, sturdy wood of oak and other northern trees, these ships were built to withstand the cruelest forces of nature. The planks that formed the hull were overlapped, riveted together with iron nails, creating a flexible yet remarkably durable structure. This design allowed the longship to absorb the shocks of crashing waves without splintering, ensuring the crew's safety and the ship's longevity. However, the true brilliance of the longship was in its adaptability. Unlike larger ships that could only navigate the open ocean, the longship could traverse shallow waters, rivers, estuaries, and fjords, giving the Vikings a strategic advantage. Their raids and explorations were not limited to coastal lands but reached deep into the heart of enemy territories, where larger ships could not follow. With its shallow draft, the longship could travel far inland, allowing the Vikings to strike swiftly and unexpectedly. It was a perfect blend of speed, stealth, and power. But it wasn't just the design that made the longship so exceptional, it was also its size. Despite its appearance, these ships were not huge, towering structures. They were surprisingly lightweight, built to be easily maneuvered by a small crew of rowers. The Viking warriors, often depicted as powerful and fearsome, were not just fighters but skilled seafarers. They could row in unison, their synchronized movements propelling the ship forward with a rhythmic power that seemed almost hypnotic. Each stroke brought them closer to their destination, whether that be a distant shore to raid or an uncharted land to explore. These ships were designed for speed and maneuverability, capable of making rapid turns and quick landings. The Vikings knew that time was often their enemy, that the longer they remained in one place, the greater the chance of discovery or counterattack. Therefore, their ships needed to be fast, allowing them to retreat as quickly as they had arrived. The Viking longship was like a living creature, agile, swift, and always ready to spring into action. And yet, despite its swift movements, it was also a sturdy vessel that could handle the weight of multiple warriors, their weapons, and their supplies. But life aboard a longship was not glamorous. The tight quarters of the ship often left little room for comfort. Below deck, the space was cramped, with little more than the barest provisions for survival. The stench of salt water and sweat hung heavily in the air, as the crew huddled together for warmth and shelter. The sun was often their only companion as they spent days, weeks, and sometimes months on the open water, with nothing but the vast expanse of ocean stretching endlessly before them. The rows of warriors would sit side by side, their eyes fixed on the horizon, their hands gripping the wooden oars with determination. Each stroke of the oar seemed to push them further from home, and yet, it also brought them closer to their destiny. The rhythmic sound of the oars cutting through the water was the heartbeat of the ship, a constant reminder that their journey was far from over. It was a quiet, meditative existence, one that required immense focus and endurance. Life on the longship was not just about physical strength, it was about mental resilience. The Vikings knew that survival at sea required more than just muscle, it demanded mental fortitude. They had to remain sharp, vigilant, and alert, always ready for the unexpected. Storms could arise at any moment, and the sea could be a cruel mistress, sending towering waves crashing over the sides of their ship. Yet the longship, with its low, sturdy design, was able to ride the waves, keeping its crew relatively safe even in the worst of conditions. It was this design that allowed the Vikings to endure long voyages, to sail through storms, and to press forward even when their strength was nearly spent. What kept them from illness and despair during these long, grueling journeys? How did they manage to avoid the sicknesses that would plague any other group of people confined to such close quarters for extended periods of time? Part of the answer lies in the way they lived on the longship. There was no separation between the sea and the ship, it was all one world. The Vikings spent every waking moment connected to the elements, living in a constant state of motion. The salt water washed over them, often cleansing their bodies of dirt and bacteria. Their exposure to the open air, the wind, and the sun strengthened their immune systems, making them less susceptible to the diseases that plagued other seafarers. In a way, the longship was not just a vessel for physical travel, it was a vessel for the Vikings' very survival. It was their home, their weapon, their tool for exploration, and their connection to the world. They did not fear the sea. They respected it, learned from it, and adapted to its ever-changing moods. The ship itself became a symbol of their resilience, a constant companion that carried them through the most difficult of times. The Viking longship was more than just a mode of transportation, it was the lifeblood of Viking society. Without it, their raids, explorations, and survival would not have been possible. The ship was the ultimate tool of the Viking way of life, a life built on movement, adaptability, and strength. To sail on a Viking longship was to embrace a way of being that was deeply connected to the natural world, a world where survival was not just about conquering others, but about understanding and adapting to the forces of nature. And so, as the longship sails into the distance, cutting through the waves with silent power, we are reminded that the Vikings were not just warriors, They were masters of their environment, with the sea and their ships as their greatest allies. The ship was both their means of survival and the very essence of their legacy. It was a world of wood, wind, and water, a world where the Vikings thrived, not because they feared the sea, but because they knew how to sail its vast, untamed expanse. As the longship sliced through the waves, its crew was faced with an ever-present challenge: how to sustain themselves during months at sea, far from the comforts of home. The wind in their sails carried them forward, but it was the food they consumed that kept them strong, focused, and able to endure the hardships of their journey. The Viking diet, though simple and often repetitive, was designed with one thing in mind: survival. It was a diet rooted in practicality, resilience, and an intimate understanding of the natural world, and it played an integral role in ensuring that the Vikings could remain healthy despite the grueling conditions of life on the sea. Imagine, if you will, stepping into the galley of a Viking longship. The air is thick with the scent of saltwater and wood, and there's little space to move. The crew, exhausted from hours of rowing, sits in silence, sharing the few provisions that remain. There are no steaming hot meals, no fresh vegetables, and no fruits picked from a nearby garden. Instead, the food is simple, hearty, and designed to last. The Vikings were practical people, and their food reflected that. What they ate on their voyages was not about indulgence or flavor, but about survival, keeping their bodies fueled and their minds sharp enough to face the dangers of the open sea. The centerpiece of the Viking diet was meat. Salted fish, dried venison, and cured pork were staples on board the longship. These foods were not just part of the Vikings' daily routine, they were their lifelines. The preservation of food through salting, drying, and smoking allowed it to withstand the rigors of long voyages. Fresh food was a luxury that was rarely available, especially on journeys that could last several months. Without refrigeration, the Vikings had no choice but to rely on these methods of preservation, ensuring that their food could survive the harsh conditions of the sea. Salted fish was perhaps the most common of all the Viking staples. Caught fresh from the cold northern waters, fish like herring, cod, and salmon were preserved through salting and drying, giving them a long shelf life. These fish were packed with protein and omega-3 fatty acids, which provided the Vikings with the energy needed for their demanding lifestyle. Salt, too, was an invaluable resource. It helped preserve not only fish but also meat and other perishable goods, allowing the Vikings to stockpile food for their long journeys. The act of salting the fish was not just a culinary process. It was a vital step in the Vikings' survival strategy. In addition to fish, dried meats were also a key part of the Viking diet. Venison, boar, and beef were often dried and cured, ensuring they could be stored for long periods. The drying process removed moisture from the meat, preventing the growth of bacteria and ensuring that the meat would remain edible even after weeks or months at sea. These meats were rich in protein, providing the Vikings with the necessary nutrients to keep their muscles strong and their bodies resilient. Though dried meat could be tough and chewy, it was a critical source of sustenance, particularly when fresh supplies ran low. Hardtack, stale, dry biscuits, was another common food aboard the longship. Though it was simple and unappetizing, hardtack was a durable food that could last for months without spoiling. Made from flour, water, and salt, it was often used to fill the gaps when other foods were scarce. Its dense, dry texture made it difficult to eat, but when soaked in water, broth, or fermented drink, it became more palatable. Hardtack was a food of necessity, a simple yet effective way to stretch the Vikings' limited food supply. Despite its lack of flavor, it was a staple in their diet, and it provided the necessary carbohydrates to fuel their daily activities. Fermented foods, too, played an important role in the Viking diet. While the Vikings did not have access to modern refrigeration, they were adept at using fermentation to preserve foods and beverages. One of the most important fermented drinks aboard the longship was ale, which was brewed from barley, rye, or oats. Ale was a common drink in Viking society, consumed not only for hydration but also for its nutritional value. It provided carbohydrates, and the fermentation process helped to break down the sugars, making it easier for the body to digest and absorb nutrients. For the Vikings, ale was a source of both comfort and sustenance, and it was often consumed in large quantities during their long journeys. In addition to fermented drinks, The Vikings also consumed fermented foods such as sauerkraut and pickled vegetables. These foods were packed with probiotics, which helped to support the Vikings' digestive health and immune systems. The fermentation process not only preserved the vegetables but also enhanced their nutritional value. In a world without modern medicine, the Vikings understood the importance of maintaining a healthy gut, and their diet reflected this wisdom. These fermented foods were a crucial part of their survival strategy, helping to keep their bodies in balance and ward off illness. While the diet aboard the Longship was centered around preserved foods, it was not without its challenges. Fresh fruits and vegetables were almost impossible to come by during long voyages, and the Vikings knew that they needed to make do with what they had. They did, however, take advantage of any opportunity to forage for fresh food when they reached new lands. Berries, wild herbs, and edible plants were gathered during shore stops, adding a welcome variety to their diet. However, these fresh foods were not always available, and the Vikings had to rely on their preserved provisions to get them through the long stretches of open water. Despite the limited variety, the Viking diet was designed to fuel their bodies in the most efficient way possible. Each food was carefully chosen for its nutritional value and ability to withstand the challenges of long voyages. While the diet may seem monotonous to us today, it was a perfect reflection of the Viking spirit, resilient, resourceful, and focused on survival. The Vikings understood that in order to survive the harsh conditions of the sea, they needed to make use of the resources available to them and adapt to the environment in which they lived. The simplicity of the Viking diet also mirrored their relationship with nature. They did not waste resources or seek excess. Instead, they made the most of what the land and sea provided. They were pragmatic in their approach to food, understanding that it was not about indulgence or luxury but about sustaining themselves for the journey ahead. The Vikings knew how to make do with what they had, using their knowledge of the natural world to survive in one of the harshest environments imaginable. In many ways, the Viking diet was a reflection of the Viking philosophy itself, simple, direct, and focused on what truly mattered: survival. It was a diet that allowed them to thrive in the most unforgiving conditions, enabling them to sail across vast oceans, raid distant shores, and endure the challenges of the sea for months at a time. The food they ate was not just fuel, it was a testament to their strength, their resourcefulness, and their unyielding determination to survive. As the days passed, and the Longships sailed ever onward, the crew would share these humble meals, knowing that each bite was a step closer to their destination. They relied on the food that had been carefully prepared and preserved, understanding that it was their lifeline. The Viking diet may have been simple, but it was powerful, a reflection of the resourcefulness and endurance that defined the Viking way of life. In the harsh and unforgiving world of the Vikings, where the elements and disease constantly threatened their survival, their approach to hygiene may seem rudimentary compared to modern standards, but it was far more advanced than many people might imagine. Though they had no modern understanding of germs or bacteria, the Vikings possessed a deep connection to nature and a remarkable practical wisdom when it came to maintaining their health. Hygiene, while simple, was an integral part of their daily lives, one that helped protect them from illness and keep them strong enough to endure the dangers of their treacherous voyages. Imagine the scene on board one of the Viking longships. The air is thick with the smell of salt water and the sea, mingled with the musk of sweat and leather. The crew, their faces weathered by the wind and sun, work tirelessly, rowing for hours on end. There is little space on the narrow deck, and cleanliness is not a luxury. Yet, despite these conditions, the Vikings understood the importance of maintaining personal hygiene. To the modern mind, their methods might seem crude, but they were surprisingly effective in preventing illness and ensuring the Vikings' physical resilience. One of the most important elements of Viking hygiene was the use of water. Fresh water was a valuable resource, especially during long journeys at sea when access to clean water was limited. The Vikings, however, had learned how to make the most of the water they had. In their home territories, they had access to numerous streams, rivers, and lakes, and they were known to bathe regularly in these natural waters. It was a daily ritual, one that not only helped them cleanse their bodies but also served as a vital way to relax and rejuvenate after a hard day of work. Bathing was a communal activity, and the Vikings would gather in rivers or hot springs, washing away the grime of their travels. These baths were not just for cleanliness, they were also a social gathering, a time for relaxation and the strengthening of bonds among the crew. On board the longships, where fresh water was a scarce commodity, the Vikings had to adapt their practices. They did not have access to modern conveniences like showers or running water, yet they found ways to maintain some level of cleanliness. Salt water, though harsh, served as a natural disinfectant. Vikings would often wash themselves in the sea, scrubbing their bodies with sand or rough cloths. While it was a far cry from the luxurious baths of today, this practice helped to remove the dirt and sweat that accumulated during their long voyages. The salt in the water also acted as a preservative for the skin, and it may have contributed to their resilience against infections, helping to prevent the spread of diseases that would have thrived in unsanitary conditions. In addition to the basic practice of bathing, the Vikings also had access to natural remedies that helped to keep their bodies in balance. They had an extensive knowledge of herbs, plants, and other natural substances, many of which had antibacterial and antifungal properties. The Vikings would use these plants in a variety of ways, either as teas, poultices, or ointments. Some of the most common medicinal herbs included yarrow, sage, and juniper. Yarrow, for example, was used to treat wounds and stop bleeding, while sage was believed to cleanse the body and protect it from illness. Juniper berries were used for their antiseptic qualities and to purify the air. These herbs were not only essential for treating illness but also helped the Vikings maintain a certain level of cleanliness, especially when resources were scarce. The Vikings also understood the importance of personal grooming. While they may not have had the same tools we use today, they were known to be meticulous about their appearance, at least by the standards of their time. Archaeological evidence suggests that Viking men, in particular, took great care in maintaining their facial hair, often trimming their beards and mustaches with small, carefully crafted combs. These combs, made from wood or bone, have been found in Viking burial sites, showing the attention to detail that the Vikings paid to their grooming practices. Similarly, Viking women were often depicted with long, braided hair, which they carefully tended to, using combs and brushes made from bone or antler. Personal grooming, though not always a priority in the midst of battle or long voyages, was nonetheless a part of Viking culture, and it helped to foster a sense of personal pride and order amidst the chaos of daily life. Yet, hygiene was not just a matter of keeping the body clean, it was also about preventing disease. The Vikings lived in a world where illness could strike at any moment, often with devastating consequences. In an age without antibiotics or vaccines, the best defense against disease was to maintain a healthy environment and to keep the body strong and resilient. To that end, the Vikings were careful to maintain the cleanliness of their living spaces as well. On their ships, the deck was swept regularly to remove waste, and the small living quarters were kept as tidy as possible, even in the cramped and uncomfortable conditions. While there was no way to fully escape the dangers of infection, the Vikings did what they could to reduce the risk of disease by keeping their immediate surroundings relatively clean. The Vikings' diet, too, played a significant role in their hygiene and overall health. As we have already discussed, their diet was rich in salted and dried meats, fish, and fermented foods, nutrient-dense staples that helped to build and maintain a strong immune system. Fermented foods, in particular, were valuable for their probiotic content, which helped to support digestive health and immune function. The Vikings' understanding of the connection between food and health was not based on modern science, but it was a highly practical approach that had evolved over generations. Perhaps one of the most fascinating aspects of Viking hygiene was their use of a type of toothpaste. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Vikings used a powder made from crushed herbs and ash to clean their teeth. This natural dental care, though primitive by today's standards, helped to keep their teeth clean and free from decay. The Vikings' commitment to hygiene extended even to their teeth, an essential part of their survival, particularly when it came to eating the tough, dried meats and fish that formed the core of their diet. Even their clothing was designed with cleanliness in mind. Viking clothing was made from wool, which is naturally resistant to dirt and bacteria. The tight-knit fibers of wool helped to keep the body warm, even when wet, and provided a natural barrier against the elements. Wool also has antimicrobial properties, which helped to keep the Vikings' clothing relatively free from odors and bacteria. This practical clothing choice was a reflection of the Vikings' resourcefulness and understanding of the natural world around them. While the Vikings' hygiene practices may seem simple by modern standards, they were remarkably effective. In a world without antibiotics or modern medical knowledge, the Vikings relied on the natural resources available to them to keep their bodies clean and healthy. Their knowledge of herbs, their use of saltwater and natural remedies, and their commitment to personal grooming and cleanliness all played a crucial role in ensuring their survival. These practices helped them stay strong enough to endure the rigors of their voyages and the dangers of their battles. Hygiene, for the Vikings, was not just a matter of cleanliness, it was a matter of survival. As we continue to explore the extraordinary resilience of the Vikings, it becomes clear that their health practices were far more sophisticated than many give them credit for. Their ability to maintain their physical well-being in such a harsh and unforgiving environment speaks to their remarkable adaptability and deep connection to the world around them. The Vikings' health practices, though simple, were integral to their survival, and they are a testament to the power of knowledge passed down through generations, a knowledge that helped them conquer vast territories and endure the trials of their time. The Viking longships, with their slender wooden bodies, seemed to merge seamlessly with the rhythm of the sea. As the crew rowed in unison, their oars slicing through the water, the air around them was always in motion. Wind, salt, and the whisper of waves against the hull. Life at sea was marked by the constant embrace of the natural elements. And while many would have seen this exposure as a perilous curse, the Vikings viewed it as an essential part of their survival, a necessary partnership with the raw forces of nature that could both challenge and sustain them. Imagine the feeling of the cold sea breeze biting at your skin, the taste of salt in the air, and the rhythmic creak of the ship beneath your feet. You stand at the edge of the longship, your gaze stretching over the vast, unbroken horizon. The Vikings, no strangers to harsh conditions, were intimately connected to the elements. Their very survival depended not only on their resilience and strength but also on their ability to adapt to the natural world around them, particularly the ever-changing winds and the power of fresh air. The sea, in its vastness, was both their greatest adversary and their greatest ally. Yet, it was the fresh, open air that played a surprisingly significant role in helping them avoid the illnesses that would have devastated other seafaring peoples. The relentless wind and the bracing sea air did far more than simply challenge the Vikings' resolve. They helped to strengthen their immune systems. In a world where bacteria and diseases could spread rapidly in confined spaces, exposure to the open elements was a natural defense. The Vikings spent most of their days in the open air, with the wind sweeping through their hair and the sun warming their backs during the brief moments of calm. This constant exposure to the elements, especially fresh, untainted air, helped to cleanse their bodies in ways that modern medicine only began to understand centuries later. Their immune systems, constantly bombarded by the fresh air and the ever-present saltwater, became resilient, toughened by their environment. The sea air, rich with negative ions, is known to have a number of health benefits. In modern studies, it has been found that exposure to sea air can improve lung function, increase serotonin levels, and reduce stress. For the Vikings, this was not a scientific understanding but an instinctive connection to their world. The longer they stayed at sea, the more their bodies became attuned to the rhythms of the environment. The fresh air they breathed acted as a natural cleanser, strengthening their lungs and invigorating their bodies, making them less prone to the diseases and infections that would have taken hold in a closed, stagnant environment. When you picture a Viking at sea, you might imagine a warrior with his gaze fixed ahead, his muscles rippling with the effort of rowing. But his health, his very ability to endure the relentless hardships of the journey, was inextricably linked to the environment around him. The air was his lifeline. It was his first line of defense against the toxins and sicknesses that could easily spread within the cramped, confined spaces of the longship. The constant movement, the exposure to natural elements, created an environment where pathogens struggled to survive. Unlike the closed quarters of modern ships, where air was stagnant and disease could quickly take hold, the Viking longship offered the refreshing, purifying touch of nature, constantly renewing the crew's strength and resilience. But it wasn't just the air that protected the Vikings. It was the entire relationship they had with the natural world. The wind itself, a force that seemed both fierce and relentless, was not only their guide but also a protective shield. The Viking longships were built with this very purpose in mind, to harness the power of the wind. The sail, though simple in design, was a masterpiece of Viking engineering. It caught the wind and propelled the ship across the open sea, allowing the Vikings to travel great distances with relative speed and efficiency. The constant interplay between the sea, the air, and the ship was a dynamic dance, one that demanded respect and understanding. In addition to the physical benefits of fresh air, there was also the mental clarity that came with it. The Vikings were accustomed to long hours of rowing, but during those moments when the wind was favorable, they would rest, their bodies still, their minds free. The sound of the wind rushing through the sail and the spray of salt water on their faces became a form of meditation. The fresh air seemed to clear away the fog of exhaustion, sharpening their senses and allowing them to stay alert and focused. This mental clarity was crucial, for the Vikings knew that vigilance was essential in their world. Storms could arise at any moment, or an enemy could appear on the horizon without warning. In a world dominated by the unpredictable forces of nature, the Vikings needed every advantage they could get, and fresh air provided them with just that. At sea, they were in constant motion, both physically and mentally. There was no time for stagnation, no room for the apathy that might set in if they were confined to land for too long. The sea was a living, breathing entity, and the Vikings had learned to navigate its challenges with a deep respect for its power. The fresh air was an essential part of this respect, an acknowledgement of the forces that shaped their lives. It was not just a force of nature but a source of strength, helping to clear their minds, strengthen their bodies, and deepen their connection to the world around them. Even when the journey became grueling, with days of heavy winds and relentless storms, the Vikings continued to embrace the elements. Their bodies, honed by years of exposure to the natural world, had learned to withstand the harshest conditions. The air, whether warm and gentle or cold and biting, was always a reminder that they were alive, that they were part of something larger than themselves. This deep connection to the world around them helped the Vikings maintain their sense of purpose and drive. They were not merely survivors, they were warriors, explorers, and conquerors, each journey across the sea a testament to their strength and their understanding of the elements. When the longship finally reached land after months at sea, the Vikings would often pause, stepping onto solid ground once again. They would breathe in the air, deep and steady, as if they were reconnecting with something sacred. The shift from the constant motion of the sea to the stillness of land was always marked by a deep breath, a moment of gratitude for the power of the air that had carried them through. The air, the wind, and the salt water had protected them, sustained them, and given them the strength to face whatever came next. The Vikings understood something that we are only beginning to realize today, that the air we breathe and the environment we live in have a profound effect on our health and well-being. They knew instinctively that the natural world, with its winds and its seas, was not just a backdrop to their lives, it was a vital part of their survival. The fresh air they breathed on their long voyages helped to protect them from illness, keeping them strong and resilient in ways we are only beginning to understand. As the longship sails into the distance, carried by the wind, we are reminded of the profound relationship between the Vikings and the natural world. The fresh air was more than just a breath of wind, it was a source of life, a force that helped them navigate the unpredictable seas and emerge stronger for the journey. The Viking longship cut through the ocean, a slender silhouette against the vast, rolling sea. The air was briny, alive with the sting of salt and the constant movement of wind and water. On board, the crew rowed in unison, their muscles straining with each stroke, their bodies braced for the hardships of the journey. They were no strangers to the dangers of the sea, but what most people didn't realize was that the Vikings weren't just fighting the elements and enemy forces, they were also constantly defending their own bodies from the silent enemy, illness. While disease was a constant threat, the Vikings had a secret weapon, one that worked quietly within them, silently guarding them against the invisible forces that could take down even the strongest of men, their immune system. Imagine standing among these warriors, rowing alongside them as the waves crash against the sides of the ship. You feel the constant sway, the salt on your skin, and the wind tugging at your hair. These men were not merely surviving, they were thriving in conditions that would have broken others. Their strength was not just physical but biological, grounded in a resilient immune system that had adapted to the brutal environment in which they lived. The Viking body, honed by years of exposure to harsh conditions, was built for survival, its defenses stronger, more efficient, and more finely tuned than those of many other peoples at the time. The human immune system is a complex network of cells, proteins, and organs that work together to defend the body against harmful invaders like bacteria, viruses, and parasites. For most people, the immune system operates silently in the background, fighting off infection without notice. For the Vikings, however, this defense was not a passive process. It was an active, essential part of their daily lives, continuously strengthened by the natural elements they encountered. Their exposure to the harsh conditions of the north, the salt water, the bitter cold, and the constant motion of the sea had created an immune system that was not only more robust but more capable of warding off the diseases that would have felled other groups. One of the main factors that contributed to the Vikings' strong immune systems was their constant exposure to the outdoors. They did not live in sterile, climate-controlled homes. Instead, they spent much of their lives in the open air, their bodies regularly exposed to the bacteria and viruses of the natural world. The cold air, the salt water, and the environmental stresses of living in such a harsh climate acted as natural stimulants for their immune systems. These conditions essentially trained the Vikings' bodies to be constantly on alert, ready to respond to any threat that came their way. The salt water itself played a crucial role in their immunity. When the Vikings spent days or weeks at sea, their skin was constantly exposed to the salt water, which had natural antibacterial properties. This exposure helped to keep their skin clean, free from the harmful bacteria and fungi that could cause infection. Salt water has been used for centuries in many cultures for its purifying properties, and the Vikings intuitively understood its value. The salt not only kept them clean but acted as a safeguard, preventing the spread of infections that could easily ravage a tight-knit crew confined to a small space for extended periods. The Vikings' immune systems were also strengthened by their diet. The food they ate was nutrient-dense, rich in the vitamins and minerals necessary to maintain a healthy body. They consumed a diet high in protein, which is essential for the immune system's proper functioning. The salted and dried meats, fish, and fermented foods they ate were packed with the nutrients needed to keep their bodies strong. Fermented foods, in particular, played a significant role in maintaining gut health, which is intrinsically linked to immune function. Foods like sauerkraut, pickled vegetables, and fermented fish provided essential probiotics that supported the Vikings' digestive systems, ensuring that their bodies could properly absorb nutrients and ward off harmful pathogens. Their diet was also rich in natural antioxidants, particularly from the herbs and plants they used in their cooking. The Vikings were known to use a variety of herbs for both culinary and medicinal purposes. Herbs like sage, juniper, and yarrow not only added flavor to their meals but also possessed powerful antimicrobial properties that helped to keep them healthy. Yarrow, for instance, was often used to treat wounds and stop bleeding, while juniper berries were believed to have purifying properties. The Vikings' deep knowledge of the natural world allowed them to incorporate these plants into their diet, fortifying their bodies against disease and boosting their immune systems in ways that modern science would later understand. In addition to their diet and environmental factors, the Vikings' active lifestyle also played a crucial role in maintaining their immune systems. The constant physical activity of rowing, running, fighting, and working kept their bodies in peak condition. Exercise is one of the most effective ways to boost the immune system, and the Vikings were constantly on the move, whether they were preparing for battle or navigating the open sea. Physical activity stimulates the circulation of immune cells throughout the body, helping to fight off infection and promoting overall health. Furthermore, the Vikings' psychological resilience contributed to their immune function. Stress is a known suppressor of the immune system, but the Vikings' ability to endure hardship and maintain a strong mental focus likely helped them to keep their immune systems functioning at their best. The Viking mentality was one of endurance, of never giving in to fear or despair, no matter how dire the situation. This mental fortitude, combined with their physical resilience, allowed them to keep sickness at bay, even in the most extreme conditions. Perhaps one of the most remarkable aspects of the Viking immune system was its adaptability. The Vikings did not have access to modern medicine, but their bodies had evolved over centuries to survive in an unforgiving environment. They had learned to fight off infections, endure the rigors of life at sea, and maintain their health despite the constant threats posed by disease. Their immune systems had adapted to the challenges of their environment, becoming finely tuned to the demands of the harsh northern climate, the saltwater, and the physical strain of their daily lives. Yet, despite their strong immune systems, the Vikings were not immune to illness altogether. They faced outbreaks of disease, just as any population would. However, their immune systems allowed them to survive longer and endure more than many other groups. Even when sickness did strike, their bodies were often able to recover more quickly, aided by the resilience they had built through years of exposure to the elements and their harsh way of life. Their bodies, hardened by their environment, were able to withstand the most dangerous of diseases, giving them an edge over other groups who lived in more sheltered conditions. The Viking immune system, while not invincible, was a testament to the strength of the human body and its remarkable ability to adapt. Their constant exposure to the natural world, their nutrient-rich diet, and their physically demanding lifestyle all played a part in making their immune system strong and resilient. The Vikings, with their relentless courage and resourcefulness, had become living examples of the power of the body's defenses. They were survivors, not just because of their strength or their weapons, but because of the natural defenses that had been honed over centuries of living in one of the harshest environments on Earth. As we reflect on the Vikings' strength and resilience, we are reminded that survival is not just about brute force. It is about adapting to the world around us, learning to live in harmony with nature, and understanding the intricate relationship between our bodies and the environment. The Viking immune system was a product of their way of life, one that emphasized strength, endurance, and an unbreakable connection to the forces of nature. In this way, the Vikings were not just warriors of the sea, they were warriors of survival, their immune systems acting as a silent, powerful force that helped them conquer both the elements and the dangers of their world. Amidst the constant motion of the Viking longship, with its creaking hull and the rhythmic sound of oars dipping in and out of the water, sleep was a rare and precious commodity. For a crew that had to remain ever vigilant against the unpredictable forces of the sea, the idea of restful sleep was something of a luxury. Yet, despite the challenges of life at sea, the Vikings had a surprisingly refined approach to rest, an essential practice that allowed them to endure the grueling months on the water without succumbing to exhaustion or illness. The Viking sleep cycle was not one of endless hours of uninterrupted slumber, but rather a balance of moments of rest, recovery, and alertness, one that kept them sharp and ready for anything that might come their way. Imagine yourself aboard the Longship, your body weary from hours of rowing, your hands sore from gripping the oar. The sun has set, and the vast darkness of the night wraps itself around you. The ship still moves, cutting through the waves with a steady, hypnotic rhythm. The crew has settled into their routines, each man finding a place to rest, though not all at once. The ship is a place of constant motion. If it's not the water that calls for attention, then it's the need to be ready for any sudden shift in weather or the appearance of an enemy vessel on the horizon. The crew, then, must sleep in intervals, taking turns to rest in shifts, while others continue to row or stay on watch. Sleep, in such an environment, was often fragmented, but it was just as critical to the Vikings' survival as their physical strength. The Viking sleep cycle was built around necessity. In such cramped conditions, sleep was never a luxury, it was a survival strategy. When sailing, the Vikings were often at sea for days, weeks, and even months at a time, with limited opportunities to stop and rest. The idea of a full, uninterrupted night's sleep, as we understand it today, was a distant reality for these seafarers. Instead, they relied on polyphasic sleep, sleeping in multiple shorter periods throughout the day and night. This cycle allowed them to remain alert and ready to respond to the ever-present threats of the sea. During the day, when the weather allowed, some of the crew could rest while others kept rowing. The relentless motion of the oars, as well as the cold sea air, could make it difficult to sleep for long stretches. However, the Vikings had developed an incredible ability to sleep during short breaks, even while lying in cramped and uncomfortable spaces. Their bodies had adapted to this form of rest, and they became expert power nappers, able to slip into a brief but restorative sleep during the limited moments when they could afford to let their guard down. At night, the longship continued its journey, with the crew alternating in shifts to keep watch. Those who were not on duty could rest in their designated areas below deck, though space was minimal and privacy was nearly non-existent. The ship's cramped quarters were shared by men who had spent months together in close proximity, and sleeping arrangements were far from ideal. Yet, even in these challenging conditions, the Vikings understood the importance of sleep for their mental and physical well-being. Without rest, they could not perform at their peak, and without peak performance, their survival rate would diminish dramatically. The key was balancing the need for sleep with the demands of the environment, and the Vikings had mastered this delicate dance. The sleep patterns of the Vikings were undoubtedly influenced by the natural rhythms of the world around them. In the far northern latitudes, where the days of summer stretched on seemingly forever and the nights of winter could last for weeks, the Vikings had to adapt to the ebb and flow of daylight. During the summer months, the long hours of daylight meant that the crew would often sail through the night, catching brief moments of sleep when they could, while in the winter, when the days were short and the nights long, their routines adjusted accordingly. The Vikings were not merely dependent on the clock, they were attuned to the natural world, using the cycles of light and dark to guide their sleep patterns. But it wasn't just the sailors on the ships who had to adjust their sleep. Life in Viking settlements was also shaped by a unique understanding of rest. The Viking society was built around a rhythm of hard work, communal living, and preparation for the unknown. In their villages, sleep was often divided into segments, with a first sleep during the evening, followed by a wakeful period in the middle of the night, and then a second sleep before dawn. This natural division of sleep, though not as well documented as today's understanding of sleep cycles, reflected a cultural adaptability to the forces of nature. The Viking sleep cycle was also influenced by their deep connection to the land and the sea. For the Vikings, life was a constant balancing act. When they weren't sailing or raiding, they were working the land, hunting, or preparing for the next journey. Even in these quieter times, rest was not something to be taken for granted. The Vikings were constantly on alert, whether for the potential arrival of invaders or the dangers of their environment. Even during their moments of rest, they had to stay vigilant. But this vigilance did not preclude rest. The Vikings understood that the key to maintaining their strength, endurance, and mental clarity lay in balancing activity with recovery. And in their fragmented, polyphasic sleep patterns, they had found a solution that allowed them to remain alert yet rested, constantly ready for whatever the next challenge would bring. There was also an element of community in their sleep patterns. On board the longships as well as in their villages, the Vikings understood that rest was a shared responsibility. When one person slept, others remained on guard, watching for threats and ensuring that the group could function cohesively. This communal approach to rest created a sense of mutual trust and camaraderie that helped the Vikings endure even the most difficult circumstances. The bond between a Viking and his comrades was strengthened not just by shared work, but by shared moments of rest, those rare and fleeting times when they could close their eyes and drift into sleep, knowing that someone else was awake, watching over them. As the longships sailed into the night, and the stars glimmered overhead, the Vikings took advantage of every possible moment of rest. But sleep was always tempered by the knowledge that danger could strike at any time. They were warriors, explorers, and traders, and every moment of rest came with the underlying awareness that they had to be prepared to spring into action at a moment's notice. Sleep, in their world, was not a break from the chaos. It was part of the rhythm of life, a necessary foundation for the work and survival that lay ahead. Despite the challenges of fragmented sleep and the harsh conditions of their voyages, the Vikings were able to maintain their strength and alertness through their unique sleep practices. Their bodies had adapted to the rhythm of the sea, their minds trained to sleep in brief, restorative bursts, while still remaining vigilant to the world around them. This ability to find rest in the midst of chaos, to balance action with recovery, was one of the many traits that allowed the Vikings to thrive in an unpredictable world. In the stillness of the night, As the longship continued its journey, you can almost hear the soft breathing of the crew, the quiet sighs of men who had learned to find peace even in the most turbulent of circumstances. Sleep, for the Vikings, was not just about rest, it was about survival. And in the balance between wakefulness and slumber, they had found the strength to endure and conquer whatever lay ahead. Life on the Viking longship was not for the faint of heart. The harsh winds, the unrelenting waves, and the constant threat of hostile forces required more than just physical strength. It demanded an unyielding mental resilience. Each Viking who embarked on a voyage knew that their mind would be tested just as much as their body. The journey across the open sea could stretch on for months, often with little more than the sight of endless water on the horizon. Yet, despite the grueling hardships they faced, the Vikings developed a mental fortitude that allowed them to persevere, survive, and conquer the challenges that awaited them. Imagine standing on the deck of the longship, your muscles sore from hours of rowing, your eyes squinting against the wind and the spray of salt water. The sea stretches out endlessly in every direction, and the feeling of isolation is almost overwhelming. But amid this vast emptiness, there is also a deep sense of purpose. The Vikings were not just voyaging across the sea for exploration, they were driven by the desire for wealth, honor, and glory. The mental resilience that defined them was deeply rooted in their worldview. They were not just warriors, they were conquerors of both land and mind, accustomed to hardship and ever ready to face the next challenge. What set the Vikings apart was their understanding that mental toughness was as crucial as physical strength. In their world, survival depended not only on the ability to wield a sword or navigate the seas but also on the capacity to endure psychological stress. In an era without modern medicine or psychological support, the Vikings had to rely on their mental strength to manage fear, stress, and isolation. The constant exposure to danger, the loneliness of long voyages, and the need to stay alert in the face of uncertain circumstances all demanded a mindset that could handle immense pressure. Mental resilience for the Vikings began with a deep sense of stoicism, an acceptance of the harshness of their environment. They understood that hardship was an inescapable part of life, and rather than shy away from it, they leaned into it. The Viking mentality was one of enduring suffering with grace, knowing that every trial was an opportunity to grow stronger. This acceptance of hardship was not about fatalism or surrender, it was about the recognition that the world was unpredictable and often merciless. The Vikings did not hope for an easy life. Instead, they prepared themselves for the challenges that would inevitably come. They trained their minds to handle discomfort, uncertainty, and danger without losing focus or purpose. This mental resilience was also nurtured through a strong sense of camaraderie. On board the longships, the Vikings were bound not only by their shared goal but by the understanding that they relied on each other's strength. The communal aspect of Viking life fostered a sense of mutual support. When one member of the crew faltered, others were there to lift him up, to remind him of the shared purpose that united them all. This sense of brotherhood helped to buffer the mental strain of long voyages, turning isolation into a collective strength. Even in the most trying moments, the knowledge that the crew would face the challenges together was a powerful motivator, reinforcing the mental toughness needed to keep going. In addition to their sense of camaraderie, the Vikings were guided by a deeply ingrained belief in fate. This belief, which was rooted in their Norse mythology, shaped how they viewed their lives and their struggles. To the Vikings, fate was an unavoidable force, but it was also a source of strength. They believed that their actions, their courage, and their endurance were not random, they were part of a larger, divine plan. This belief in fate provided them with a sense of purpose that transcended the immediate challenges they faced. Even in the most difficult moments, they could draw on the knowledge that they were part of something greater, that their struggles were meaningful and their sacrifices were not in vain. The Vikings' mental resilience was also closely linked to their warrior ethos. From an early age, Viking children were raised with the understanding that strength, both mental and physical, was paramount. They were taught the art of war, the importance of honor, and the need to remain composed under pressure. Young Vikings were encouraged to embrace hardship, whether through physical training or endurance tests, as a way of preparing their minds for the demands of battle and exploration. The Vikings believed that fear was something to be overcome, not something to be avoided. The ability to face danger with courage and calmness was considered one of the highest virtues. Moreover, the Vikings were not just warriors, they were storytellers, and their stories were an essential tool in building mental resilience. The sagas, epic tales of gods, heroes, and battles, were passed down through generations. These stories were more than just entertainment, they were a source of inspiration and a means of shaping the Viking identity. They reinforced the idea that suffering was part of the human experience, but it was also something that could be overcome through strength, honor, and determination. The sagas provided a mental framework for the Vikings, helping them to see their own lives in the context of a grand narrative, where every challenge was a chapter in their personal saga of survival and conquest. The act of storytelling also served as a form of mental release. When the crew was not engaged in the physical labor of rowing or battling the elements, they often shared stories around the fire. These moments of communal storytelling allowed the Vikings to connect with one another emotionally, to vent their frustrations, and to reframe their hardships. This practice helped to reduce stress, build emotional resilience, and provide a sense of continuity in the face of the chaos and uncertainty of life on the sea. The act of sharing stories allowed the Vikings to mentally process their experiences, reinforcing their collective identity and fortifying their resolve. However, mental resilience also had a darker side. The Viking warriors were often thrust into situations that required them to suppress their emotions and endure extreme stress. In battle, they had to overcome fear, deal with loss, and maintain a sense of control in the face of chaos. But this emotional suppression came at a cost. The Vikings, much like warriors in other cultures, faced the psychological toll of their lifestyle. The trauma of battle, the constant exposure to death, and the mental strain of living on the edge of survival could lead to what we now understand as post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD. While the Vikings did not have the language to describe these conditions, their resilience was often tested by the emotional scars left by their way of life. Despite these challenges, the Vikings' ability to endure and thrive in the face of adversity speaks to the power of mental resilience. They understood that their survival depended not just on physical strength but on their ability to adapt mentally, to accept hardship, to remain focused on their goals, and to support one another through their struggles. The strength of the Viking mind was a defining feature of their culture, one that allowed them to sail across uncharted waters, to conquer new lands, and to build a legacy that would endure for centuries. As the Longship continued its journey across the open sea, the Vikings rowed with a quiet determination, their minds focused on the challenges ahead. The waves might crash against the ship, the winds might howl in their faces, but they remained steadfast. Their resilience, honed through years of training and guided by their deep sense of purpose, allowed them to face whatever came their way, no matter how impossible the odds. And in that quiet, unwavering determination, the true strength of the Viking spirit lay. The Viking longship, cutting through the endless expanse of water, was not just a vessel of wood and iron, it was a reflection of the strength found in unity. Every Viking aboard was an essential part of the crew, and the success of their journey depended on the seamless cooperation of all. Life at sea was harsh, unpredictable, and often dangerous, but the Vikings had learned that their survival depended on a powerful, unspoken truth: strength lies in numbers. Their world was one of fierce individualism, but also of deep communal bonds. The Viking mindset was built not just on the resilience of the individual, but on the collective power of the group. It was a society where each person contributed to the whole, and where no man stood alone in the face of adversity. Imagine yourself aboard the Longship, surrounded by the rhythmic sounds of the crew working in unison. The creak of the oars, the murmur of voices, the shared sense of purpose. It is a feeling of collective strength, of belonging to something greater than yourself. As you row alongside your comrades, there is no doubt in your mind. Your survival depends on your ability to work together. The Viking community was not built around a solitary existence. It was built around cooperation, mutual respect, and the understanding that each person's contribution mattered. The Vikings were a warrior society, but they were also a communal people. Their villages were close-knit, and their social structures were designed to encourage interdependence. In times of peace, These communities relied on the labor of farmers, traders, and craftsmen. But in times of war or exploration, every able-bodied man and woman was expected to contribute to the effort, whether by fighting, sailing, or supporting those who did. This sense of communal responsibility was instilled from a young age, as Viking children were raised with the understanding that their place in society was part of a larger network of relationships. It was not simply a matter of individual achievement, it was about the collective success of the group. On the longships, this sense of community was even more pronounced. The physical demands of rowing, the shared hardships of life at sea, and the constant threat of danger created an unbreakable bond between the crew members. Each Viking on the ship played a critical role in ensuring the ship moved forward, whether by rowing, keeping watch, or tending to the needs of the crew. A failure in one part of the team could result in failure for the entire crew. And so, the bond between shipmates was deep, built not only on respect but on a shared commitment to the journey and to one another's survival. The bond between Vikings at sea was similar to the relationships formed in their home villages. The communal spirit that existed in Viking society was often grounded in kinship and shared goals. Viking families were large and tightly knit, and their ties extended beyond immediate family to include cousins, uncles, aunts, and even distant relatives. The social fabric of Viking life was held together by the understanding that each person was accountable to the group. This sense of interconnectedness was central to the Viking way of life, and it provided the strength needed to endure the trials of battle and exploration. In battle, the Vikings' sense of community was even more evident. They fought side by side, relying on each other's strength and skill. The Viking warrior ethos was not one of lone heroes, but of brothers and comrades in arms. When a Viking went into battle, he knew that his survival depended on his comrades as much as it did on his own abilities. This collective sense of purpose allowed the Vikings to face overwhelming odds with courage. Even when facing an enemy larger or better equipped, they believed that their unity would be their greatest weapon. The idea of dying alone in battle was anathema to Viking culture. They fought for their families, for their comrades, and for the community as a whole. On the longships, this communal spirit was particularly vital. The physical demands of the journey meant that no one could afford to slack off or abandon their post. Rowing for hours on end, in cold and rough seas, required a collective effort. It was not just about the power of the individual oarsman. It was about the synchronized movement of the entire crew. When the crew rowed in unison, their rhythm and coordination allowed them to move more efficiently across the water. The success of the journey depended not just on the strength of any one person, but on the ability of the group to work together as a cohesive unit. This shared effort was what allowed the Vikings to travel across vast distances, explore new lands, and establish settlements far from home. But the Viking community was not limited to the crew of the longship. It extended to the wider network of Viking society. Viking leaders, such as chieftains and kings, understood the importance of maintaining the strength of the community. They did not rule in isolation, they ruled as part of a larger network of alliances and relationships. The leaders were expected to act as protectors and providers for their people, ensuring the welfare of the entire group. In return, the community supported the leader, not out of fear, but out of a shared sense of loyalty and respect. This mutual dependency was central to the structure of Viking society, where each individual had a role to play in sustaining the whole. The strength of the Viking community was also reflected in their cultural practices. Festivals, feasts, and religious ceremonies brought people together, reinforcing the bonds between individuals and families. These communal events were more than just celebrations. They were opportunities to reinforce social ties, share resources, and reaffirm the values of the community. The Viking sagas, which told the stories of their ancestors and gods, were not just historical records, they were part of the cultural fabric that united the Viking people. By sharing these stories, the Vikings connected with their past, with their heroes, and with each other. The collective memory of their achievements, struggles, and triumphs helped to sustain them in times of adversity. In times of hardship, the Vikings also relied on their community to provide emotional support. Life at sea was dangerous, and the isolation of long voyages could take a toll on the crew's morale. In such times, the sense of belonging to something larger than oneself provided comfort. Knowing that others shared the same struggles, fears, and hopes helped to alleviate the psychological burden of the journey. The bonds of brotherhood and the communal spirit that permeated Viking society gave each individual the strength to carry on, even in the face of overwhelming challenges. The Vikings' ability to rely on one another in times of crisis was a key factor in their success. Whether in battle, on the open sea, or in the face of personal loss, they knew that the strength of the community would carry them through. It was this deep sense of interconnectedness that allowed them to conquer not just foreign lands but the very challenges of survival itself. The Vikings understood that no man is an island. Their collective strength was the foundation of their enduring legacy. As you imagine life aboard the Longship, the sounds of the sea and the crew working in unison, you realize that this community, bound by shared purpose and mutual respect, was the true source of the Vikings' strength. It was not just the warriors, the sailors, or the leaders who mattered, it was everyone working together toward a common goal. And in that unity, the Vikings found the resilience to survive, to conquer, and to thrive. The rhythmic splash of oars in the water, the constant creak of the Longship's wooden frame, and the salt in the air made each day at sea feel like a test of endurance. Every Viking aboard the ship knew that their strength, their ability to endure the grueling journey, relied not only on their resilience and willpower but also on the sustenance that fueled their bodies. The Viking diet, though often simple, was a carefully designed system that provided the energy and nutrition needed to face the harsh conditions of the sea. For the Vikings, food was not just a source of survival, it was the fuel that allowed them to conquer new lands, endure long voyages, and thrive in an unforgiving world. Imagine yourself aboard one of these ships, the wind whipping through your hair, the horizon stretching endlessly ahead. The day has been long, with hours spent rowing through choppy seas, and your muscles ache from the constant motion. As night falls, the crew gathers to eat. The meals may not be luxurious, but they are hearty, packed with the calories needed to keep them going. Salted fish, dried meat, barley bread, and fermented dairy, simple ingredients that have been prepared to last and to provide the energy needed for the journey ahead. The food is not just sustenance. It is a reminder of the resourcefulness and practicality that defined the Viking way of life. The Viking diet was shaped by necessity. The Vikings spent long periods of time at sea, where fresh food was difficult to come by. As a result, their diet was based on foods that could be preserved for extended periods without spoiling. Salting, drying, smoking, and fermenting were essential methods of preserving meat, fish, and dairy, ensuring that the crew had enough to eat during their voyages. These preservation techniques allowed the Vikings to take food with them on long journeys, whether they were raiding distant shores or exploring new territories. Salted fish and dried meats were staples of the Viking diet. The cold northern seas were rich with fish, particularly herring, cod, and salmon, which were caught in abundance. These fish were salted and dried to preserve them for long periods, providing a reliable source of protein throughout the journey. Dried meats, such as beef and mutton, were also common, often preserved in the same way. These dried foods were practical for life at sea. They were lightweight, easy to store, and packed with the energy needed to sustain the crew through long hours of rowing and fighting. In addition to fish and meat, barley was a crucial component of the Viking diet. Barley, a hardy grain that could withstand the harsh climate of the north, was used to make a variety of foods, from porridge to bread. The Vikings often ground the barley into flour, which could be mixed with water to create a simple, filling porridge or made into flatbreads. These barley-based foods were rich in carbohydrates, providing the Vikings with a steady source of energy for their physically demanding lives. In an age where quick access to food was not always possible, the Vikings relied on these energy-dense staples to keep their bodies fueled and strong. Fermented dairy products also played a significant role in the Viking diet. The Vikings were skilled at producing milk-based foods such as cheese and butter, which could be stored for long periods and added to meals for flavor and nutrition. These dairy products were particularly valuable for their high fat content, which provided the Vikings with much-needed calories. The fat in butter and cheese helped to keep the body energized, especially during the colder months when energy demands were higher. Additionally, fermented dairy products like yogurt and skyr, a type of Icelandic yogurt, were rich in probiotics, promoting healthy digestion and boosting the immune system. The Viking diet was not just about survival, it was also about balance. The food they consumed was not only designed to provide the energy needed to withstand the hardships of the sea and battle, but it also helped to maintain overall health. The Vikings understood the importance of nutrition in staying strong and capable, even in the face of extreme challenges. For instance, they supplemented their diet with wild fruits, berries, nuts, and root vegetables, which they could gather during their travels or grow in their settlements. These foods provided essential vitamins and minerals, ensuring that the Vikings' bodies received the nutrients needed to function optimally. While the Viking diet was grounded in practicality, it was also shaped by cultural beliefs and practices. Food was not just fuel, it was a part of the Viking identity, tied to their sense of community and their connection to the land and the sea. The Vikings were known to offer sacrifices to the gods before embarking on important voyages, and food played a central role in these rituals. Feasts, often held in honor of gods and ancestors, were a way for the Vikings to celebrate their success and renew their bond with their community. At these feasts, roasted meats, bread, and dairy products would have been shared among the warriors, reinforcing the sense of camaraderie that was so crucial to Viking society. The Vikings' understanding of food and its role in their lives was also influenced by their knowledge of the land. The food they ate was closely tied to the natural world around them. They hunted wild game, gathered herbs and berries, and harvested what the land provided. In many ways, the Vikings' diet reflected their resourcefulness and their ability to live in harmony with the environment. They did not waste anything. Every part of an animal was used, whether for food, clothing, or tools. Similarly, they utilized the plants and herbs around them for both culinary and medicinal purposes, ensuring that nothing went to waste. Life on the Longship, however, posed unique challenges when it came to food preparation. The limited space and the constant motion of the ship meant that cooking had to be done efficiently and without the luxury of a fully equipped kitchen. The Vikings relied on simple, portable cooking tools, such as pots and cauldrons, to prepare their meals. Cooking was often done over an open fire, which could be tricky in the wind and rain of the open sea. Despite these challenges, the Vikings were adept at preparing meals that could be cooked quickly and efficiently, providing the crew with the energy needed to keep moving. But the Viking diet was not just about practicalities, it was also a reflection of the Viking spirit. The food they ate, often simple but hearty, spoke to their ruggedness, their ability to endure, and their deep connection to the natural world. For the Vikings, food was not just sustenance, it was a symbol of survival, of resilience, and of the bond they shared as a community. Each meal, whether it was a simple bowl of porridge or a feast with roasted meats and bread, was a reminder that they had the strength to face whatever challenges lay ahead. As the Longships sailed across the horizon, the crew continued to row, the rhythm of their movement synchronized, their bodies fueled by the food that sustained them. The journey was long, and the days at sea were often filled with hardship, but the Vikings knew that they had what they needed to endure. Their diet, rooted in practicality, resourcefulness, and community, provided them with the strength to face the unknown, to brave the storms, and to conquer the challenges of the world they inhabited. Food, in their world, was not just a means to an end, it was an essential part of the journey, the lifeblood that kept them going, day after day, until they reached their destination. The Viking longship sliced through the waves, its sleek form cutting across the sea like a bird in flight. But as much as the crew relied on their strength, coordination, and endurance, their greatest asset was something far less tangible: their ability to navigate the vast, unpredictable ocean. To the modern mind, the idea of crossing the uncharted seas with only the stars and the shifting tides for guidance seems impossible. Yet, for the Vikings, this was not just a skill, it was a way of life. The Vikings had mastered the art of navigation, using both the natural world around them and their own unique tools to guide them across thousands of miles of open water. Imagine yourself aboard one of these longships, the wind in your face, the salt water spraying your skin. The sun is high in the sky, and you squint into the distance, but there's nothing but an endless expanse of blue. The crew is rowing in unison, the rhythm of their movements synchronized. But you know that the direction they're traveling is no accident. In the Viking world, navigation was not a matter of luck, It was a skill passed down through generations, a complex system of reading the stars, understanding the tides, and interpreting the signs of the sea. The Vikings relied heavily on the sun to help them find their way. They had a unique method of using the position of the sun to determine their course, particularly during the long days of summer when daylight stretched into the hours of twilight. By observing the sun's arc across the sky and the changing patterns of light and shadow, Vikings could keep track of time and direction. They used tools such as the sunstone, a type of crystal that helped them locate the position of the sun even when it was obscured by clouds or fog. This remarkable tool, though shrouded in mystery for centuries, was based on the principle of polarizing light. The Vikings would hold the sunstone up to the sky and turn it until they could detect the clearest light, which indicated the direction of the sun. This allowed them to maintain their course even when the sun itself was hidden from view, a method that was far ahead of its time. But the Vikings did not rely solely on the sun. They were keen observers of the stars, which they used to guide them during the long nights of their voyages. The stars were their celestial map, their constant companions on the journey. The most important star for the Vikings was the North Star, Polaris, which remained fixed in the sky, always pointing to true north. By using Polaris as a reference, the Vikings could determine their orientation and adjust their course accordingly. They also used the constellations as markers, identifying familiar patterns in the night sky and aligning them with the points of the compass. In addition to the stars, the Vikings had an intuitive understanding of the sea itself. They knew how to read the winds, the currents, and the waves. The sea was not a chaotic, unpredictable force to them. It was a living, breathing entity with its own rhythms and patterns. By studying the behavior of the waves and the direction of the wind, the Vikings could predict the weather and adjust their sails for maximum efficiency. They knew which currents to follow and which to avoid, understanding that the tides could either help them or hinder them on their journey. The Vikings were not only navigators in the traditional sense, they were also keen observers of the natural world, capable of interpreting the subtle signs that others might miss. This intimate knowledge of the sea was also tied to the Vikings' incredible sense of direction. Unlike many other cultures of the time, the Vikings did not rely on maps in the way we understand them today. Instead, they used a system of landmarks and natural features to guide their voyages. They would memorize the shapes of coastlines, the location of specific islands, and the landmarks on the horizon. These features acted as waypoints, helping the crew to stay on course as they traveled. The Vikings also had a rich oral tradition, passing down knowledge of these landmarks and routes through storytelling and song. Navigators would often sing songs that described the journey, encoding the details of the landscape and the route into the melody. This was a way of preserving the knowledge for future generations, ensuring that the wisdom of the past would not be lost. Another crucial aspect of Viking navigation was their ability to read the clouds and the weather. The Vikings were experts in interpreting the patterns of clouds, which could indicate changes in the wind or the arrival of storms. They understood that certain types of clouds were associated with specific weather patterns, and they could predict whether a storm was coming or whether the weather would be calm. This knowledge was particularly important during their long voyages, as the Vikings had to be prepared for the sudden shifts in weather that could arise on the open sea. The Vikings also used the birds to help guide their way. Seabirds, particularly gulls and ravens, were often seen as signs of land. If a Viking ship spotted a flock of seabirds flying in a particular direction, they knew that land was nearby. The birds, too, followed their own patterns, often leading the Vikings toward the coastlines of distant shores. The presence of birds was one of the clearest indicators that land was close, and the Vikings relied on this natural clue to help them navigate across the open ocean. In addition to these natural methods, the Vikings also used more practical tools to aid in their navigation. The most famous of these tools was the compass, a rudimentary compass that allowed the Vikings to determine their direction even on cloudy days or when the sun was hidden. The Viking compass was often made of a simple, flat piece of wood, with a pointer that would align with the magnetic field of the Earth. This early compass allowed the Vikings to navigate with remarkable precision, even when the skies were overcast. Despite the ingenuity of their navigation methods, the Vikings were not immune to the dangers of the sea. Storms, rough waters, and unpredictable currents could easily send a ship off course, even with the best navigational skills. Yet, it was their unwavering determination and adaptability that allowed them to survive these challenges. The Vikings knew that their success as explorers and raiders depended on their ability to adapt to the ever-changing environment of the sea. They trusted their knowledge of the natural world and relied on it to guide them through the unknown. At the heart of Viking navigation was not just their technical skill, but their deep connection to the world around them. The stars, the sea, the winds, and the animals, they all played a role in the Vikings' understanding of the world. To them, navigation was not just a practical task, it was a spiritual one. It was a way of connecting with the forces of nature, of working in harmony with the world to reach their destination. The Vikings did not simply chart a course across the sea, they engaged in a dialogue with the world, interpreting its signs and responding accordingly. As the Longship continued its journey, the crew relied on these skills and tools, navigating the vast expanse of the sea with a sense of purpose and certainty. The rhythm of the oars, the alignment of the stars, the subtle shift in the wind, it was all part of the journey, a journey that required not just strength and endurance, but an intimate knowledge of the world around them. The Vikings had conquered the seas, not through brute force, but through their remarkable ability to read and understand the signs of the natural world. The wind carries with it the echoes of history, whispers from a time long past. It is a sound that evokes images of Viking longships cutting through the fog, of warriors with iron helmets and shields raised in defiance of the unknown. The Vikings, whose name still conjures up images of fierce warriors and distant raids, left an indelible mark on the world that stretches far beyond their time. Their legacy is not just one of bloodshed and conquest, it is a legacy of exploration, innovation, and cultural exchange, one that continues to influence the modern world in ways that are often overlooked. Imagine standing at the edge of a cliff, looking out over the vast expanse of water. In the distance, you can see the faint outline of land, a place once unknown to the world. It is the same feeling the Vikings must have had when they set out on their voyages, the excitement of discovery, the uncertainty of what lay ahead. Their ability to explore and navigate vast distances is perhaps one of their most enduring contributions. The Vikings were not just warriors, they were pioneers, the original explorers of the North, and their journeys paved the way for centuries of exploration that followed. The Viking Age, which spanned from roughly the 8th to the 11th century, was a time of unprecedented mobility and expansion. The Vikings traveled across Europe, Asia, and even North America, leaving their mark on every land they touched. They established settlements in distant lands, including modern-day England, Ireland, France, Russia, and Iceland. Their raids and exploration led to the creation of a vast network of trade routes, connecting distant regions and fostering cultural exchange. This interconnectedness laid the groundwork for the globalized world we live in today. In a sense, the Vikings were the first global travelers, laying the foundation for international trade, communication, and cultural fusion long before the age of modern exploration. One of the most profound impacts the Vikings had on the modern world was through their influence on language. The Viking invasions, particularly in the British Isles, introduced Old Norse into the languages of the regions they conquered. The result was a fusion of cultures and languages that has had a lasting effect on the English language, in particular. Many common English words have their roots in Old Norse, especially in areas like law, government, and everyday life. Words like law, skirt, and window all trace their origins back to the Viking era. This linguistic exchange between the Vikings and the Anglo-Saxons created a hybrid language that helped shape the modern English language we know today. Beyond language, the Vikings left their mark on legal systems and governance. The Vikings were known for their unique approach to justice and governance, which was based on communal decision-making and the concept of the Thing, a public assembly where disputes were settled and laws were made. This system of participatory governance influenced the development of modern legal systems, especially in Scandinavia and the British Isles. The idea of a common assembly where free men could come together to discuss issues and pass laws can be seen as a precursor to the democratic systems that would later emerge in the Western world. The Vikings, in their own way, helped to lay the foundations for the rule of law and the principles of justice that continue to guide societies today. The Vikings were also instrumental in shaping the modern world through their innovations in shipbuilding and navigation. Their longships, with their sleek design and shallow draft, were the epitome of naval engineering. These ships allowed the Vikings to travel across vast distances, navigating not only the open seas but also rivers and shallow waters that other vessels could not reach. The longship's design, with its speed, agility, and ability to be rowed or sailed, was a marvel of its time. It enabled the Vikings to raid, trade, and explore with unparalleled efficiency. In fact, many of the shipbuilding techniques pioneered by the Vikings were later adopted by other cultures, influencing the development of naval technology in Europe and beyond. In the world of exploration, the Vikings were also the first known Europeans to reach North America, nearly 500 years before Columbus. The story of Leif Erikson, who is believed to have sailed from Greenland to the shores of what is now Newfoundland, is one of the greatest feats of Viking exploration. Though their settlement in North America was short-lived, the Vikings' discovery of the New World is a testament to their remarkable navigational skills and adventurous spirit. Today, their voyages are celebrated as part of the broader history of exploration, a reminder that the Vikings were far more than just raiders. They were true pioneers who helped to expand the boundaries of the known world. The Vikings also played a significant role in the development of the modern concept of trade. They were not just warriors and settlers, they were skilled traders who established extensive trade networks across Europe, the Middle East, and Asia. These trade routes connected the farthest reaches of the known world, facilitating the exchange of goods, ideas, and cultures. The Vikings traded everything from furs and timber to silver, glass, and exotic goods from the East. Through their interactions with other cultures, the Vikings helped to create a more interconnected world, where goods and ideas could flow freely between regions. Their legacy as traders and merchants helped to lay the groundwork for the global trading systems that would develop in the centuries that followed. Even in the modern world, the Vikings' influence can be seen in various aspects of popular culture. The image of the Viking warrior, fierce, independent, and adventurous, has become an enduring symbol of strength and resilience. Movies, television shows, books, and video games continue to depict the Vikings as larger-than-life figures, heroes and villains whose stories captivate audiences around the world. This romanticized image of the Vikings has kept their legacy alive, fueling interest in their culture and history. But beyond the myth, the true legacy of the Vikings lies in their contributions to the modern world, many of which are still felt today. The Viking spirit of exploration and adventure continues to inspire people to push the boundaries of the unknown. In many ways, the Vikings represent a time of human potential, when individuals and societies dared to venture beyond their limits, to face the dangers of the unknown, and to leave their mark on the world. Their legacy is one of boldness, resilience, and creativity. The Vikings were a people who understood the value of both individual strength and communal cooperation, and they built a world that was interconnected through trade, exploration, and cultural exchange. As you stand once again at the edge of the cliff, watching the sea stretch out before you, you can almost hear the call of the Viking spirit, an invitation to continue the journey, to embrace the unknown, and to build a legacy that will endure for generations. The Vikings, in their time, forged new paths across the world. Today, we continue to follow those paths, guided by the lessons they left behind.